This program is brought to you by the Center for a Sustainable Today. Our world is an amazing, complex living organism, and we coexist in a symbiotic relationship. With this great power comes a great responsibility to ensure the future by taking steps to be sustainable today.
I think a lot of times when we think about sustainability, it's about the things we're doing wrong or the things that we're not being conscious of or mistakes that we're making. And I really like this idea of cultural sustainability and really focusing on the gifts and the strengths and the values and the beliefs that we have and carrying that forward. And I think that particularly in the Native community, a lot of our culture and beliefs and values naturally support a lot of other behaviors such as conservation, such as environmental consciousness, all of those pieces. And so what I think a lot about is how do we sustain our culture, how do we sustain our values, how do we ensure that our children have a strong sense of who they are and what their responsibilities are.
And now here is the host of Sustainable Today.
Hello, I'm Sarah Bagby. Welcome to Sustainable Today. Now today we're going to be focusing on the Native Americans and how they survived for hundreds and thousands of years off of the land. We even have a house behind me, a plank house made of cedar, just like the ones that they lived in.
Thank you.
The event we are attending is called Bird Fest. It's held here on the beautiful Ridgefield Wildlife Refuge in Washington State, where the Cathlapotle plank house is located. This area and its exhibits and features are open to the public for most of the year, but it closes in fall for the winter season. Birdfest is a closing ceremony of sorts where people are invited to come and share in an intense and personal encounter with the indigenous knowledge of the Chinook tribe. And we're going to take a look inside and see all the different tools and artifacts and how they lived inside one of those houses. We had 900 people living in a settlement of 14 houses just like the one behind me. We also have a traditional salmon bake that we're going to be watching and maybe even taste a little. We'll also take a little nature walk around here, see all of the different plants and wildlife and how they lived off of it back then and how we could now today. Come on in and let's take a look inside the Cathlapotle house. There's a special way to walk in.
Traditionally, when you enter a Chinook house for the first time, you go in backwards. So until the people inside the house recognize you and know who you are and why you're there, you come in backwards to show that you mean no harm. Cathlapotle was occupied from 1450 to about 1830-ish. Cathlapotle was probably one of the largest villages along the Columbia. Okay. The Chinook basically settled from Celilo Falls up by the Dalles all the way down both sides of the river to the mouth and then up north and south of the mouth a little ways. And so at least one explorer gave an account of coming down the river. He would see, just as he started to lose sight of the smoke from the last village, he would see the smoke of the next one. So there was village after village after village all the way down both sides of the Columbia. They shared a culture, they shared a tradition. They'd been on this land, at least documented on the wildlife refuge. The earliest site here is dated to 2500 BC. So they had been on this place in this site for a very long time, probably with living in the same sort of cultural setup that they had done for centuries. As far as I know, this is the largest settled population that lived only by hunting and gathering. They didn't do agriculture, they didn't raise animals. So most of the time when you get big settled populations, it's because they're growing their own food or they're raising cattle in order to be able to support a large population in one place. The Chinook never did that. So because there's so much abundance, there's so much stuff on this land that they can live on, they were able to gather everything that they needed in excess because they also traded. They never grew their own food. They did manage the land, so they would burn the grasslands in order to increase the Camas and to encourage elk to come down here because elk like to forage in big grassy areas. What the archaeologists have told us from the evidence that they found at the site is that the elk that were here were about 30% bigger than the elk we see today. I can tell you that at Cathlapotle, they specialized in processing elk hide, and they produced a product called a clammon that's like an elk hide armor. They fixed it so that the elk hide was about 1/2 of an inch thick, and it was a garment that basically left your right arm free so that you could wield your weapon. So you hooked it here, and then it was basically like a long, straight garment that opened on the right-hand side. It was a huge, huge export item here. But there was a trade route that went from Boston where they brought trade goods to come here. They traded for a variety of things, but specialized in trading for these. Then took the clammon armor up to British Columbia, where they traded these for sea otter pelts, and then they went to China and sold them. The hides weren't worn a lot as outer clothing here because of the rain. When hides get wet, it takes a really long time for them to dry.
And heavy. Well, then what would they be using for rain?
Cedar.
They just wear cedar clothes.
Because cedar is partially water repellent. These folks used cedar for practically everything. They used the cedar, different parts of the cedar for different things. So this part of the cedar bark is what's used to make that. And this, so this is also made out of cedar bark. Inside the bark, there's another layer, so you can peel off the inside and you get this. You can split it into long strips, and then you can use that for weaving. So this is how this hat was made. You put one of these hats on, so the water's coming off and down. Then you've got a cape that ties around here, so the water that hits your shoulders runs down off the bottom. You're pretty reasonably water repellent. So you can do everything with this stuff.
And you just don't go out and pull a piece of bark off the cedar tree, you know. You go out there and you make that connection with that cedar tree, and you ask for permission to pull bark from that cedar tree, maybe offer a song, and peel that one piece of bark, you know, one piece of bark off that tree. And then when you're done, you know, you may want to gift it some tobacco and maybe some more songs, but it's all about respecting that tree. You know, I've been in the forest and I've seen trees this big with a scar on one side of them, knowing that our ancestors had pulled bark off there, maybe to make a hat or maybe to make a cape or skirt or something. So it's evidence that the respect was there and that tree continues to live.
Flint Knapping. Flint Knapping, only it's obsidian.
Outside the plank house, several craftsmen demonstrate the skills of the Chinook tribe, who used to fashion tools from their natural surroundings. Many of these skills are still practiced today.
Way faster. This month is being run across the whole Flat Valley was estimated. So you read like the
Oh, because it's a, I see, it's a bag. Do you see that too? I didn't know that either.
Preserving indigenous knowledge is also the job of Dina Dart. She is the curator of the Native American art exhibit at the Portland Art Museum. Dina was not able to visit the Plank House for her presentation this year, so we came to the museum for a special tour.
It's important to the Chinook people to let the world know that they're still here, that they're still practicing the sustainable way of harvesting and the artistic practices that they always have. And one of my goals as curator of Native American art here at the Portland Art Museum is to facilitate access to our historic art collection so that their carvers and weavers can come in and spend time with those ancestral objects, replicate them or be inspired by them to help their artistic practices stay vibrant and alive as well. It's literally impossible to speak to the changing landscape of the Columbia Plateau or the settler population of the Columbia Plateau while standing in front of a basket. You can talk about how the environment informed the weaver 200 years ago because you can see the river ripples or the mountain design, right? But you can't speak to the change in resources. You can't really speak to climate change and the lack of those resources or the difficulty that the weavers now have in obtaining the resources to weave. But with the Joe Feddersen piece, you can speak to these new innovations and things that have come into the Columbia Plateau that now inform the artists as well. So they're informed by their ancestors and their ancestral language and their ancestral place. But that ancestral place looks different than it did 150 years ago. It's been my goal since I came to the Portland Art Museum 3 years ago to bridge this incredible historic collection that exists in this museum with contemporary works, not just contemporary works that mimic works of the past that could be mistaken for historic works or works of the past, but edgy contemporary modern art being made by the Oregon Indian peoples. In this case here, we've got these three incredible historic works. We've got this beargrass dance apron, a dentalium purse, and then the carved anthropomorphic figure. These objects were chosen by the elders and faculty at the Native American Youth and Family Association to tell their object story about. So Lillian Pitt chose the small anthropomorphic figure, prehistoric work that has actually inspired much of her work. Many of the same design elements that show up in this prehistoric work show up in Lillian's work. The ripples of the water, the unibrow, as we call it, the ribs. And in Lillian's piece, she's a woman. In the spot of her belly button, she's got the symbol of eternity or eternal life. We can look at the object that inspired her, and then we can look at the work that was the product of that inspiration. The Kaila Farrell Smith, it's called Boarding School in Mourning, and it speaks to the intergenerational trauma of the boarding school era. It's a self-portrait. It's Kaila with her hair cut the way it would have been cut had she been enrolled in a boarding school. The red lines on her face represent the mourning, the tears. If you look closely, however, her hair isn't completely gone, it's only obstructed, which speaks to her Native identity. It's still very much a part of who she is, although there was an attempt to remove who she is from her biological form. The Joe Feddersen piece, it's called Roll Call, and it was a set of those fused glass panels which represent the folks who would show up at a roll call today in the Columbia Plateau. So it's a different cast of characters than it might have been 150 years ago, right? And the four that I chose from the series all represent a trickster or a tricky conveyor of information, right? On the bottom left, we've got the white wolf or the wolf in sheep's clothing, the flat screen, right? The TV, the way that the media brings us false truths, as does the magpie. The magpie in Columbia Plateau culture is seen as the trickster, the one that's always telling a story that may or may not be true. And then the guy, the white guy, is also a new addition to the cast of characters on the Columbia Plateau and can't always be trusted, right? Can't always rely upon the story that's being told. I think that we're telling a much deeper, richer, more relevant story, a story about climate change, a story about social and cultural change, and the things that have mattered most to Indian people over the last 100 years.
Visitors are treated to a walk and talk about the various plants that abound at this site and to learn how these resources were put to use by the tribe. The connection between plant life and the indigenous people is called ethnobotany.
We are really lucky to be able to be here with this plant today, and absolutely very important ethnobotanical plant in terms of food. Look at this, you guys. It's amazing. Look at this Wapato. And you can almost just like feel them kind of like calling out to you. Everywhere that this plant is, it is a beloved food. Do you know what parts people ate?
Is it the root?
The root, yeah, mainly. But the leaves, as they're emerging, are also edible, and all parts of this plant are edible when it's time. In the spring, there are no tubers, but there are fresh leaves, and they all have kind of like a culinary valuable flavor, but it's also a little bit what I would describe as swampy. They are exactly straight replacement for potato. Most of the time when I've harvested it, you wait until the water comes back, until the rains return. And so it's just starting to get cold. It's not the most comfortable activity to do in like early November. To harvest this plant, you have to dance in the muck, like up to your waist in water. And you do that, and then eventually, boop, 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 these purple tubers start floating to the surface. And that's how you harvest them. You just scoop them up off the surface of the water. Growing all over these grassy areas that we've been passing are one of the most prized plant foods, especially in terms of starch and carbohydrates that people here would use. Can anyone guess what's here under the surface of the ground? Camas, thank you. This is one of the plants that people in the Pacific Northwest did not farm. People were able to just like lift up this whole section of the soil and take the largest bulbs and set all the rest back down. And those ones have been aerated. They're not so root bound with their neighbors anymore because there's been spaces made in between them, and there's also been holes for baby seeds to fall. When we harvest camas, we take those bulbs, the biggest ones, and we peel them and we cook them really slow. They have the same starch. If anyone's ever tasted Jerusalem artichoke, it's a starch that is indigestible as is, but if you cook it really low and slow, that starch converts into simple sugars. And in the case of camas, traditional pit roasting can take like around 36 hours. Fully converted camas is like a sweet potato cooked for hours in brown sugar, only firmer. And you can just smash them a little bit flat and dry them in the sun, and that's food to go for a long time. Camas is hands down the most delicious wild food I've ever tasted. So there are camas under here, and they've probably just been, the delicate little dried out seed heads are brittle. One thing to mention is that there's a lookalike. Does anyone know the name of the lookalike?
Death camas.
Yes, so there's another plant called death camas. They've reclassified it out of the lily family, Zygodinus, and there's a lot of patterns that are different about Zygodinus, but the bulb looks, in my opinion, 100% identical. I really can't tell unless I taste it, and even then sometimes I think it would be tricky. So it's not something for pure beginners to delve into. So come out with me sometime and I'll teach you how to harvest camas. Blackberries. One of the elements of this landscape are these magnificent trees. The Oregon white oak is the one oak that we have here. And so acorns offer an abundant food source in this ecosystem. The acorns that the oak trees produce are very high in a chemical called tannin, which is a bitter, astringent chemical that if we ate the acorns straight, they would cause so much harm to the lining of our stomach that we would get really sick. Tannins are also used as medicine, and we know a lot about the benefits of tannins that are anti-cancer, and especially for your colon and things like that. But in too high of levels, tannins are super irritating and drying of the tissues. So we have to leach them out. People here, as far as I know, would grind the acorns very fine with the same type of grinding stone that they have on display out there at the plank house. And the only way to get them fine enough is by using special baskets made of special plants that take a ton of skill to make. So there's this basket that sifts the acorn in a special way, and then you can use cold water that runs through the acorn meal and leaches the tannins out, so then you can cook and eat the meal. of all the foods, of all of the grains and nuts that exist, acorn is my favorite of either of those. It's very high in protein, depending on the species. Some are, I've heard, up to 30% protein. Many of them are very high in healthy fats.
Wow, you're doing a great job there.
The area also has a wide variety of mushrooms that can be used for various purposes. The chanterelle is especially good for cooking, and the Chinook incorporated them into their diet. Fall is the best time to gather them, so we set out into the coastal mountains with John Richardson to hunt for the delectable fungi.
Now this is not anything we're really interested in. Okay. I'm only looking for chanterelle. That's the only kind I know.
So what's the best place to find these, John?
If you look around and find the biggest, best looking, healthiest looking fir tree.
Like this one next?
Look right here. It doesn't look real healthy, but it looks like it's been here a while.
Yeah.
And that's where we found our candidates. But if you notice, this is Oregon grape here.
Yeah.
See the Oregon grape? They grow in the same area as the Oregon grape and salal. Salal will grow right alongside Oregon grape.
Right.
So here's a purple one. It's not a chanterelle, but it's real pretty. Who knows what it is? Something looks like it's been eaten on.
Yeah, really. Well, hey, whatever's been eating it didn't die, right? Or maybe it did.
Not immediately. One in there.
And this.
And that one.
And this.
That's the one I saw first.
Woo-hoo. Oh, that's huge.
Look how they push up.
That's as big as your hand.
Look how they push this. This is a very...
Stick.
Look at that stick.
Look at the size of that. That's huge.
Oh yeah. See how that stick was laying here and it's just coming up on both sides of it. And here we go. It won't fit in the hole. Here we go. First of...
I think I got one right here.
There we go.
Sweet.
There's a little bit of a rotten part we'll just cut out.
We'll just take that off there. Oh man. Good job, John.
There.
What do you think? That's the find of the day?
So far,
all right.
It rivals this other one for sure.
Yeah. Man.
Two of them right close to each other.
Now, I've never seen one that big in a store.
No.
Okay. Seafood stew. We have clams, oysters, salmon, cranberries, onions. I think you said there's some crab in here. There's chanterelle mushrooms.
The chanterelle mushrooms are one of the ingredients in the seafood stew that visitors are invited to sample. Unlike the metal stock pot used here, the tribe prepared this meal in a pot made of cedar. How can you cook stew in a wooden pot?
They didn't have pottery, they didn't have metal, so they didn't have a pot they could put in the fire. So all they had was wood. They made it all, not all they had, but they used cedar in order to cook their food, so they developed what's called hot rock cooking. Not only would the fires be going 24/7, but they would be ringed with rocks so that somebody could be able to always get a fresh hot rock to be able to put into the pot that was cooking. They cook a traditional stew, so that pot would have basically everything that they currently had available. So they would put in fish and clams and camas and berries and nuts. And then you just basically keep putting hot rocks in there. The hot rocks never actually make water boil, but they get it hot enough so things like roots and meat will actually cook.
And of course, no Northwest Native American event would be complete without a traditional salmon bake. The fish were caught in the Columbia River by tribal members, baked over an open pit fire with, what else? cedar.
Well, in the old days, obviously, it was just cooked without anything on it. It was just one of many different ways to cook salmon. On nice days like this, if you had fresh salmon, it was a popular way to cook it. The old word would be quishin. The old Chinook word for roasting salmon is quishin. If the weather was right and you had fresh fish, then it was cooked in this way.
That was just a table song, you know, when we're out on journeys, you know, and people are waiting to be served, or we're in a plank house and people are waiting to get served, everybody will jump up and do their table song, you know, just to honor the people that have been cooking for us and so forth. So I just wanted to offer you this Chinook table song. So enjoy, enjoy. Sure.
Far out. You have another? I think you said there's some crab in here, there's chanterelle mushrooms.
I think there's a tremendous amount of resources out there that folks don't know. And even us, we're learning more and more about it every day, you know, about what resources were out there that's, you know, that would help us, you know, whether it be medicines. Nobody's had seal oil in a long time, you know, but I'm sure it's the biggest thing for us is, you know, the wisdom. The elders carry the wisdom, you know, and you just need to know that.
Right, to carry it on.
Carry it on. And as you learn, you know, of course with us, as you learn some of that wisdom and you learn the ways, then you start picking up on the clue that your ancestors are out there, whether it be in how the smoke swirls at a fire, or whether it be how the fog travels on the water, or, you know, different things that occur that help you out as you're on journeys, you know, and you know that the ancestors are looking down on you.
Thank you for joining us on this adventure to the Cathlapotle Cedar Plank House. We learned so much about how the indigenous cultures can help us to be sustainable in our culture. I'm Sarah Bagby, bringing you the tools to be sustainable today.